Welcome to this deep dive into one of the darkest and most unsettling tales in American history. Well, here it is. The winter of 1892 arrived early in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, blanketing the Sisters of Mercy convent with snow that muffled the world into an eerie stillness. Sister Mary Catherine stood at the frost-covered window of the chapel, her breath forming small clouds against the glass as she watched the pine trees bend under the weight of ice. At 24 years old, she had spent 6 years behind these stone walls, having taken her final vows at 18 after her parents died in a typhoid outbreak that ravaged their small mining community. The convent, perched on a hillside overlooking the town of Black Mountain, had become her entire world, a place where the rhythms of prayer and service replaced the chaos of grief that had consumed her youth. The morning bell rang at 4:30, as it did every day, calling the sisters to lauds. Sister Mary Catherine moved through the corridors with the other women, their habits rustling in unison, their faces pale in the candlelight. The cold seeped through the stone floors, numbing her feet even through the worn leather of her shoes. Mother Superior Agatha led the prayers, her voice strong despite her 70 years, echoing off the vaulted ceiling of the chapel. The words were familiar, comforting in their repetition, yet lately Sister Mary Catherine found her mind wandering during these early hours, drifting to thoughts she knew were dangerous for a woman who had pledged her life to God. The convent served the mountain community as a hospital, school, and refuge for the poor. The sisters ran a small infirmary where they treated injuries from the nearby coal mines, illnesses that swept through the crowded workers' camps, and the countless ailments that plagued families living in poverty. Sister Mary Catherine had discovered a talent for healing, her hands steady as she cleaned wounds and administered the simple remedies they prepared from mountain herbs. The work gave her purpose beyond prayer, a way to feel useful in a world that often seemed indifferent to suffering. On a gray February morning, everything changed. A mine collapse at the Stewart Creek operation brought a flood of injured men to the convent's infirmary. The sisters worked frantically, their white aprons soon stained with blood and coal dust. Among the wounded was a man named Thomas Brennan, a mine engineer from Pennsylvania who had come south to improve safety conditions in the Appalachian operations. He was 32 years old, with dark hair streaked with premature gray and eyes that held an intelligence and kindness that struck Sister Mary Catherine immediately. A support beam had fallen across his leg, crushing bones and tearing muscle, and he lay on the wooden examination table, his face pale with pain but his jaw set with determination not to cry out. Sister Mary Catherine assisted Sister Helena, the eldest and most experienced healer, as they worked to save the leg. The injury was severe, and infection was always a threat in these mountain hollows where proper medical supplies were scarce. Thomas Brennan remained conscious throughout the initial treatment, his eyes following Sister Mary Catherine's movements as she brought clean water, held his hands steady while Sister Helena set the bone, and later applied the poultices that would draw out any poison from the wound. He never spoke during those first hours, but his gaze held a gratitude mixed with something else, something that made Sister Mary Catherine's heart beat faster in a way she had not experienced since before her vows. The engineer remained in the convent's infirmary for 3 weeks as his leg slowly healed. During this time, Sister Mary Catherine found herself assigned to his care, changing his bandages twice daily, bringing him simple meals of bread and soup, and monitoring his fever as it spiked and fell. Mother Superior Agatha maintained strict rules about the sisters' interactions with men, even injured ones, but the shortage of hands during the winter illness season meant that these protocols sometimes had to bend. Sister Mary Catherine performed her duties with efficiency and proper distance, yet she could not ignore the way her hands trembled slightly when she touched his skin, or how her breath caught when their eyes met during the bandage changes. Thomas Brennan was different from the mountain men she had known in her youth. He spoke with education and refinement, discussing books he had read and places he had traveled. He had studied engineering at a university in Philadelphia and held progressive views about workers' rights and mine safety that had made him unpopular with the coal company owners but beloved by the miners. During the long winter afternoons, as Sister Mary Catherine performed her tasks in the infirmary, he would speak about his vision for safer mines, for fair wages, for company towns where families could live with dignity instead of in squalid camps where disease and despair flourished. His passion for justice resonated with something deep within her, reminding her of why she had chosen a life of service in the first place. The other sisters noticed the careful way Sister Mary Catherine moved around the engineer's bed, the extra moments she took to ensure his comfort, the slight flush in her cheeks when she emerged from the infirmary. Sister Bernadette, a young novice only 2 years behind her final vows, watched with knowing eyes but said nothing. Sister Helena, who had lived long enough to understand the human heart, observed the growing connection with concern. She had seen this before in her 40 years of convent life, and knew that such feelings, however innocent they might begin, could destroy a woman who had pledged herself to God and the Church. By the 3rd week of February, Thomas Brennan could walk with the aid of a crutch. The healing had progressed better than expected, and Mother Superior Agatha informed him that he would be discharged at the end of the month. The news should have brought relief to Sister Mary Catherine, an end to the dangerous proximity that had awakened feelings she had buried beneath 6 years of devotion and discipline. Instead, she felt a hollowness spreading through her chest, an awareness that when he left, something vital would leave with him. She prayed more fervently during these days, begging God to remove these sinful thoughts, to restore her to the purity of purpose she had known before that February morning when the mine collapsed and brought Thomas Brennan into her life. The night before his scheduled departure, Sister Mary Catherine performed her final check of the infirmary. The winter wind howled outside, rattling the shutters and sending drafts through the stone building. Thomas Brennan sat on the edge of his bed, his legs still bandaged but strong enough now to bear his weight. When Sister Mary Catherine entered, he looked up with an expression that held such longing and sadness that she had to steady herself against the doorframe. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the dim room, the single candle casting shadows that danced between them. Neither spoke, but in that silence, they both understood that something profound had passed between them, something that could never be spoken aloud within these holy walls. Sister Mary Catherine completed her rounds quickly, checking his bandage with professional efficiency, avoiding his eyes, her hands shaking as she recorded his final vital signs in the leather-bound log the sisters maintained. When she turned to leave, he spoke her name for the first time, not her religious name but her given name, Catherine, which he must have heard from one of the miners who knew her family. The sound of it, spoken in his voice, struck her like a physical blow. She did not turn back, did not acknowledge that she had heard, but walked from the room with tears streaming down her face, her rosary clutched so tightly in her hand that the beads left marks on her palm. That night, Sister Mary Catherine did not sleep. She knelt in her cell on the cold stone floor, praying until her knees ached and her voice grew hoarse. She begged the Virgin Mary for strength, for clarity, for the grace to honor her vows and forget the feelings that had taken root in her heart. But even as she prayed, she knew that something fundamental had shifted within her, that the certainty she had felt about her chosen life had developed cracks that no amount of prayer could seal. The morning bell would ring in a few hours, and Thomas Brennan would leave the convent, returning to his work in the mines, and she would remain here, bound by vows she had taken when she was barely more than a child, vows that had seemed so clear and purposeful before she understood what she was sacrificing. Thomas Brennan left the Sisters of Mercy convent on the last day of February, walking with only a slight limp. His injury healed well enough to return to his engineering work. Sister Mary Catherine watched from the chapel window as he descended the hill toward Black Mountain, his figure growing smaller against the gray winter landscape until he disappeared around a bend in the road. She thought that would be the end of it, that time and devotion would gradually erase the feelings that had taken root during those 3 weeks of his recovery. She was wrong. Spring arrived slowly in the Blue Ridge Mountains, the snow melting to reveal muddy roads and the first tentative green shoots pushing through the dead leaves. The convent's routine continued unchanged, the endless cycle of prayer and work that defined the sisters' lives. Sister Mary Catherine threw herself into her duties with renewed intensity, volunteering for the hardest tasks, spending extra hours in the infirmary, reciting additional rosaries after Compline when the other sisters had gone to their cells. Mother Superior Agatha watched this fervor with concern, recognizing it for what it was, an attempt to outrun something that could not be escaped through mere effort. In mid-March, a letter arrived at the convent addressed to Sister Mary Catherine. It came through the hands of a local physician, Dr. Samuel Warren, who occasionally consulted with the sisters on difficult cases. The letter was sealed with plain wax and carried no return address, but Sister Mary Catherine recognized the handwriting immediately. Her hands trembled as she received it from Sister Bernadette, who delivered the convent's mail. The young novice's eyes held a question, but she asked nothing, simply handing over the envelope before hurrying away to her own duties. Sister Mary Catherine did not open the letter immediately. She carried it beneath her habit, pressed against her heart, for 3 hours before she found a moment of privacy in the convent's small library. The room smelled of old books and beeswax, and dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight that slanted through the high windows. With shaking hands, she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper. The letter was brief and formal, thanking her for the care she had provided during his recovery, expressing gratitude for the sister's dedication to healing, and wishing her well in her continued service to God. But beneath these proper words, she read another message, one written in the spaces between the lines, in the careful choice of phrases that held double meanings, in the very fact that he had written at all. The letter should have been destroyed immediately. The rules of the convent were clear about correspondence between sisters and men outside their families. But Sister Mary Catherine could not bring herself to burn it. Instead, she hid it between the pages of her prayer book, a small leather volume that had belonged to her mother, marked with water stains and years of use. Over the following days, she found herself touching the place where the letter lay hidden, drawing comfort from its presence even as she knew it represented a dangerous transgression point. 3 weeks later, another letter arrived, again delivered through Dr. Warren. This one was longer, describing Thomas Brennan's return to work at the Stewart Creek mine and his efforts to implement new safety measures that the owners resisted at every turn. He wrote about the miners and their families, about children growing up in camps where disease was rampant and hope was scarce, about his frustration with men who valued profit over human life. The letter contained nothing explicitly romantic or inappropriate, yet the intimacy of his thoughts, his willingness to share his struggles and convictions with her, felt more dangerous than any declaration of love. Sister Mary Catherine knew she should confess the letters to Mother Superior Agatha, should admit to the correspondence and accept whatever penance was required. But she remained silent during her weekly confession, speaking instead of minor infractions, small failures in charity or patience, while the greater sin of deception grew heavier on her conscience. She told herself that the letters were innocent, that she was simply maintaining a connection with someone who needed spiritual support, that her responses, when she began to write back through Dr. Warren's discreet mediation, contained nothing but encouragement for his good works and assurances of prayer for his endeavors. By May, they were writing regularly, a letter every 2 weeks that chronicled their separate lives in careful, circumspect language. Thomas Brennan described his battles with the mine owners, his growing friendship with the workers, his plans for a new ventilation system that could prevent the gas explosions that killed dozens each year. Sister Mary Catherine wrote about the convent's work with the sick and poor, about the mountain families who came seeking help, about her own struggles to maintain faith in the face of so much suffering. Neither acknowledged the deeper current running beneath these words, the longing that neither could speak but both felt with increasing intensity. The letters changed Sister Mary Catherine in ways she tried to hide from the other sisters. She found herself impatient with the rigid schedule of prayers, resentful of the bells that regulated every moment of her day, restless during the long hours of silence. The life that had once provided structure and purpose now felt like a cage. She began to question things she had never questioned before, wondering why women were expected to renounce all personal desire to serve God, why love was considered incompatible with holiness, why the Church demanded such complete sacrifice from those who had often had no real choice in their vocations. Sister Helena noticed the change first. The older woman had developed a deep affection for Sister Mary Catherine over their years working together in the infirmary, and she recognized the signs of a soul in turmoil. One evening in late May, as they prepared medicines in the workroom adjacent to the infirmary, Sister Helena spoke quietly about the dangers of attachments that drew one away from God's service. She did not mention the letters directly, but her meaning was clear. She spoke of a young sister she had known decades ago, a woman who had fallen in love with a man she was nursing back to health, who had left the convent in the middle of the night and was never heard from again, excommunicated and shunned by her family, lost to poverty and disgrace. the warning terrified Sister Mary Catherine, not because she feared the consequences, but because she realized how close she had come to throwing everything away. That night, she wrote what she intended to be her final letter to Thomas Brennan, explaining that their correspondence must end, that her vows demanded complete devotion, that continuing to write would be a betrayal of everything she had promised to God. She sealed the letter and gave it to Dr. Warren during his next visit to the convent, asking him to deliver it and to refuse any future communications from the engineer. For 2 weeks, Sister Mary Catherine maintained her resolve. She prayed with renewed dedication, accepted additional penances from her confessor, volunteered for the most difficult nursing cases. The summer heat arrived, bringing with it epidemics of fever and dysentery that kept the infirmary overflowing with the sick. The work was exhausting, and Sister Mary Catherine welcomed the fatigue that left her too tired to think about anything except sleep. She believed she had made the right choice, that with time and discipline she would find her way back to the peace she had known before Thomas Brennan entered her life. Then, on a stifling July afternoon, Dr. Warren arrived at the convent with urgent news. There had been an explosion at the Stewart Creek mine, a massive blast caused by methane gas that had killed 37 men and trapped dozens more below ground. The survivors were being brought to every medical facility in the county, and the sisters were asked to prepare for a massive influx of injured miners. Sister Mary Catherine's heart stopped when she heard the news, a cold dread spreading through her chest. She wanted to ask about Thomas Brennan, needed to know if he was among the dead or injured, but could not frame the question without revealing the depth of her concern. The injured began arriving within the hour, men with burned skin and broken bodies, some barely conscious, others screaming in pain. The sisters worked through the night and into the next day. The infirmary and chapel both converted into makeshift hospitals. Sister Mary Catherine moved through the chaos with mechanical efficiency, cleaning wounds, administering laudanum for pain, holding the hands of men who would not survive their injuries. She searched each face for Thomas Brennan, dreading that she would find him among the dying, yet desperate to know he was alive. That it was not until the second day that she learned the truth. Thomas Brennan had been underground when the explosion occurred, working with a crew to install the new ventilation system he had designed. He had survived the initial blast but was trapped with 7 other men in a collapsed tunnel. Rescue efforts were underway, but the instability of the mine and the risk of further explosions made the work dangerous and slow. The chances of reaching the trapped men alive diminished with each passing hour. Sister Mary Catherine's carefully maintained composure shattered. She continued to work, to tend the injured, but moved through her duties in a state of numb terror. The other sisters attributed her distress to the scale of the disaster, to the horror of so much death and suffering, and did not question why her hands shook more than theirs or why she had to step away several times to compose herself. At night, she lay in her cell, unable to sleep, praying with a desperation she had never known before, bargaining with God in a way she knew was wrong, promising anything if Thomas Brennan could be saved. 3 days after the explosion, the rescue crews broke through to the trapped miners. 5 men had died from their injuries or from the gas that had leaked into the collapsed section. 3 survived, including Thomas Brennan. The news reached the convent through Dr. Warren, who had been working at the mine site. When Sister Mary Catherine heard that Thomas was alive, she had to excuse herself from the infirmary, rushing to the chapel where she collapsed in front of the altar, sobbing with a relief so profound it left her weak and shaking. Sister Helena found her there an hour later and helped her back to her cell without a word, understanding that some things were beyond the reach of comfort or counsel. The explosion changed everything in Black Mountain. The disaster forced the mine owners to finally implement the safety measures Thomas Brennan had proposed, but 37 families had been destroyed in the process. The convent held a memorial service for the dead, and the entire town attended, a sea of black mourning clothes filling the chapel and spilling out onto the grounds. Sister Mary Catherine stood with the other sisters, singing the hymns for the dead, watching the widows and orphan children weep, and feeling the full weight of the suffering that surrounded them all. She knew that this tragedy, horrible as it was, had given her a glimpse of what loss truly meant, and she understood that she had been living in a fantasy, imagining that her feelings for Thomas Brennan existed in some separate realm where consequences did not matter. August in the Appalachian Mountains brought a heavy, humid heat that settled over Black Mountain like a suffocating blanket. The air in the convent felt thick and stale, and the sisters moved through their duties with the sluggish movements of people exhausted by temperature and grief. The weeks following the mine disaster had taken a toll on everyone. The infirmary remained full of men still recovering from injuries, and the convent had taken in several orphan children whose fathers had died in the explosion and whose mothers could not feed them. The additional work and the emotional weight of so much loss strained the small community of sisters to their limits. Sister Mary Catherine had not heard from Thomas Brennan since the explosion. She told herself this was for the best, that the correspondence should never have begun, that the disaster had demonstrated the folly of allowing her heart to be divided between her vows and her feelings for him. She threw herself into caring for the orphan children, finding in their simple needs a distraction from her own turmoil. The youngest was only 3 years old, a little girl named Emma whose father had been killed and whose mother had died from influenza 2 months after the explosion. The child followed Sister Mary Catherine everywhere, her small hand clutching at the nun's habit, her dark eyes holding a fear and confusion that broke Sister Mary Catherine's heart daily. In late August, Mother Superior Agatha summoned Sister Mary Catherine to her office, a small room on the second floor of the main building that overlooked the vegetable garden the sisters maintained. The Mother Superior was a formidable woman, stern but not unkind, who had led the convent for 20 years with unwavering devotion and an iron sense of duty. She gestured for Sister Mary Catherine to sit in the wooden chair across from her desk, then remained silent for a long moment, studying the younger woman with eyes that seemed to see everything. Mother Superior Agatha spoke plainly and without preamble. She had become aware of the correspondence between Sister Mary Catherine and the mine engineer, Thomas Brennan. Dr. Warren, in a moment of conscience, had confessed his role in facilitating the letters, concerned that he had aided in something improper. The Mother Superior had read the letters, which Sister Mary Catherine had kept hidden in her prayer book, found during a routine inspection of the sisters' cells. The correspondence was inappropriate, regardless of how carefully worded, because it represented an emotional attachment that divided Sister Mary Catherine's heart and threatened her vows. Sister Mary Catherine felt her face burn with shame as Mother Superior Agatha spoke. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that the letters had been innocent, focused on good works and shared concerns about the suffering in the mining camps. But she knew such explanations were worthless because the truth lay not in the words of the letters but in the feelings that prompted them. She remained silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. As Mother Superior Agatha laid out the situation with devastating clarity, the Mother Superior explained that Sister Mary Catherine faced a choice. She could recommit herself to her vows, undergo a period of penance and spiritual direction, and remain with the Sisters of Mercy. This would require complete severance of all contact with Thomas Brennan, a public confession of her transgression before the community, and a transfer to another convent far from Black Mountain where she could begin again without the temptation of his proximity. The alternative was to leave the convent, to renounce her vows and return to the secular world. Mother Superior Agatha made clear that this second path would bring consequences: excommunication from the church, loss of all connection to the religious community that had been her family for 6 years, and the social stigma that would follow her for the rest of her life. The Mother Superior gave Sister Mary Catherine 3 days to make her decision. During this time, she was relieved of all duties and confined to her cell except for attendance at prayers. She was to speak to no one except her confessor and to use this time for serious contemplation of her soul's welfare. As Sister Mary Catherine left the office, Mother Superior Agatha added one final thought. She was not without sympathy for the younger woman's struggle, having experienced her own trials of faith in her youth. But she emphasized that religious life required sacrifice, that holiness demanded the subordination of personal desire to divine will, and that Sister Mary Catherine must decide whether she had the strength and conviction to make that sacrifice or whether she had mistaken a youthful grief for a genuine calling to religious life. The 3 days of isolation were the longest of Sister Mary Catherine's life. She knelt in her small cell, a space barely large enough for a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a small table with a basin for washing. The August heat made the room stifling, and sweat soaked through her heavy habit as she prayed and wrestled with her decision. She thought about her parents, dead these 10 years, and wondered what they would have wanted for her. They had been simple people, her father a miner, her mother a woman who took in laundry to help make ends meet, both of them devout Catholics who had been proud when their daughter entered the convent. Sister Mary Catherine examined her vows with a thoroughness she had never applied before. She had taken them at 18, in the immediate aftermath of her parents' deaths, when she had been drowning in grief and the convent had offered structure and purpose. She had believed then that she was answering a divine call, but now she questioned whether that call had been genuine or merely the desperate grasp of a frightened girl seeking safety. The 6 years since had been filled with meaningful work and a sense of belonging, yet she could not deny that something had always felt incomplete, some part of herself held in reserve that she had never been able to fully surrender to God. That on the second night of her confinement, Sister Mary Catherine had a moment of clarity that came not through prayer but through exhaustion. She allowed herself, for the first time, to imagine a life with Thomas Brennan. She pictured herself as his wife, living in a modest house in Black Mountain or perhaps moving to one of the northern cities where his engineering skills would be in demand. She imagined bearing children, raising a family, growing old beside a man who shared her values and her passion for justice. The vision was so vivid and so filled with warmth that it made her chest ache. But then she thought about the orphan children in the convent, about little Emma who had lost everything, about the miners' wives who had no one else to turn to when sickness struck their families. She thought about the work the sisters did, work that went beyond what any individual could accomplish alone. The third day brought no easy answer. Sister Mary Catherine understood that either choice would involve sacrifice and loss. If she stayed, she would lose the possibility of romantic love, of marriage and children, of a life shared with Thomas Brennan. If she left, she would lose her spiritual community, her purpose, her identity as a woman consecrated to God's service. The church would view her as an apostate, and the society of 1892 offered few respectable options for a woman who had broken sacred vows. She would likely face poverty, social ostracism, and the judgment of everyone who had known her as Sister Mary Catherine. That evening, as the sun set over the Blue Ridge Mountains and the bells rang for Vespers, Sister Mary Catherine made her decision. She would leave the convent. The realization brought not relief but a profound sadness, an awareness that she was closing one chapter of her life and stepping into an uncertain future. She understood that this choice would hurt people: Mother Superior Agatha, who had invested time in her training, Sister Helena, who had been like a mother to her, the other sisters who would feel betrayed by her departure. She knew that little Emma would not understand why Sister Catherine suddenly disappeared from her life. But she also knew that remaining would be a lie, that every day she stayed while loving another man would be a betrayal of the vows she had taken and the women who lived those vows with genuine devotion. Sister Mary Catherine informed Mother Superior Agatha of her decision the following morning. The older woman received the news with visible disappointment but also with a resignation that suggested she had expected this outcome. The process of leaving the convent was more complicated than Sister Mary Catherine had anticipated. There were documents to sign, interviews with the local bishop, a formal ceremony of dispensation from her vows that felt like a funeral for the person she had been for the past 6 years. She was given plain clothes to replace her habit, a small sum of money that represented her share of her parents' estate which had been held in trust by the convent, and a letter confirming her release from her religious obligations. The other sisters were informed of her departure at the morning chapter meeting. Sister Mary Catherine was not present for this announcement, but Sister Bernadette later described how Mother Superior Agatha had explained that Sister Mary Catherine was leaving due to personal reasons and that they were to pray for her soul but not to contact her or speak of her again. This was the way the church handled such departures, erasing the person from the community's collective memory as if they had never existed. Sister Mary Catherine's name would be struck from the convent's records, her cell would be assigned to another sister, and within a few months, it would be as if she had never taken her vows or spent 6 years serving God behind these walls. Sister Mary Catherine left the Sisters of Mercy Convent on September 15, 1892, walking down the same hill she had watched Thomas Brennan descend 7 months earlier. She carried a small carpet bag with her few possessions, wore a plain gray dress that felt strange after years in a habit, and felt more frightened than she had ever been in her life. Dr. Warren had agreed to let her stay temporarily in a room above his medical practice in Black Mountain while she decided what to do next. She had not contacted Thomas Brennan, did not know if he even knew she was leaving, and tried not to hope that the future held anything beyond survival and the need to find respectable work that would allow her to support herself. As she reached the bottom of the hill and entered the town, Sister Mary Catherine, who must now think of herself simply as Catherine, turned back once to look at the convent. The stone building stood solid against the mountain backdrop, its windows reflecting the morning sun, smoke rising from the chimney where the sisters were preparing the midday meal. She thought of the women inside, going about their daily routines with the certainty of purpose she had once possessed. A part of her would always belong to that place, to those years of service and sacrifice, but she could not return, could never be that person again. She turned away and walked into Black Mountain, into an uncertain future that both terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Catherine's first weeks in Black Mountain as a laywoman were marked by a disorientation so profound it felt physical. Every morning she woke in the small room above Dr. Warren's practice, momentarily confused by the absence of bells calling her to prayer, by the unfamiliar sensation of loose hair against her neck instead of the tight coif she had worn for 6 years. The town that had been visible from the convent windows now surrounded her with sounds and smells and the constant proximity of other people living their ordinary lives. She felt simultaneously conspicuous and invisible, aware that everyone knew who she was, the nun who had left the convent, yet treated as if she had materialized out of nowhere with no history or connection to anyone. Dr. Warren had been kind in providing temporary shelter, but Catherine understood she could not remain dependent on his charity indefinitely. She needed employment, a way to support herself in a society that offered limited options for unmarried women, particularly those who bore the stigma of broken religious vows. She inquired about positions as a teacher in the local school, but the school board, controlled by men closely allied with the Catholic Church, would not consider hiring someone who had abandoned her sacred commitment. She offered her services as a nurse to several families in town, but most declined, uncomfortable with inviting into their homes a woman whose very presence seemed to challenge the authority of religious institutions they revered. Thomas Brennan had been away from Black Mountain when Catherine left the convent, traveling to meetings in Charleston about new mining regulations following the Stewart Creek disaster. When he returned in early October and learned of her departure, he came immediately to Dr. Warren's practice. Catherine saw him approaching from her window and felt her heart race with a mixture of anticipation and fear. She had left the convent partly because of him, though she had told herself the decision was more complex than simply choosing love over vows. Now she faced the possibility that their connection, so powerful in the constrained context of letters and forbidden proximity, might not survive the reality of the secular world. Their reunion was awkward at first, both of them unsure how to navigate this new dynamic without the barriers that had defined their previous interactions. Thomas was different outside the context of his injury and recovery, more confident and substantial, his presence filling the small room where Catherine received visitors. He spoke carefully, asking about her well-being, expressing concern about her circumstances, but not immediately declaring the feelings that Catherine hoped he still held. She realized that months had passed since they had last seen each other, that he had endured the mine disaster and its aftermath, and that perhaps his feelings had changed or been overshadowed by the weight of witnessing so much death. But as their conversation continued, as the initial stiffness gave way to the easier communication they had developed through their letters, Catherine understood that nothing fundamental had changed between them. Thomas admitted that her decision to leave the convent had shocked him, that he had never asked or expected her to make such a sacrifice, that he felt responsible for the upheaval in her life. Catherine assured him that she had made her own choice, that the decision had been building for months and was about more than just him, though she could not deny that knowing him had forced her to confront questions she had been avoiding about her vocation and her future. Thomas asked her to marry him that same afternoon, in that small room above the doctor's practice, with a directness that would have been inappropriate in more genteel society but felt right given their circumstances. He offered her not romantic declarations but practical considerations, explaining that he had been offered a position with a mining company in western Pennsylvania that was committed to implementing the safety reforms he championed. He would have steady work and a decent income. They could make a life together away from Black Mountain, where Catherine's past would not follow her so closely, where they could build something new. He made clear that he had loved her since those weeks in the convent infirmary, but that his proposal came from respect and partnership as much as from romantic feeling. Catherine said yes, not with the giddy joy of a young girl accepting her first proposal, but with the sober awareness of a woman who understood the gravity of the commitment she was making. They planned a simple civil ceremony for early November, just before Thomas needed to travel to Pennsylvania to begin his new position. The marriage would have to be civil rather than religious because Catherine's dispensation from her vows had not yet been formally processed by the church, and no Catholic priest would perform the sacrament for a woman so recently released from religious life. This meant that in the eyes of the church, Catherine would be living in sin, another layer of ostracism to add to her already compromised social position. The weeks before the wedding were strange and rushed. Catherine helped Thomas make arrangements for their move to Pennsylvania, packing the few possessions she had accumulated and saying goodbye to the handful of people in Black Mountain who still acknowledged her existence. Dr. Warren had remained a steadfast supporter, and he hosted a small supper the night before the wedding, attended by a few of Thomas's friends from the mine and several families who had benefited from Catherine's nursing care during her time with the sisters. The gathering was modest but warm, and Catherine felt grateful for these small gestures of acceptance in a community that had largely turned its back on her. The wedding took place on November 7, 1892, in the office of a local magistrate who asked no questions about Catherine's past and performed the brief ceremony with efficient professionalism. Catherine wore a simple blue dress borrowed from Dr. Warren's housekeeper, held a small bouquet of late-blooming mountain laurel, and stood beside Thomas as they made their vows to each other before two witnesses, a miner named John Fletcher and his wife Margaret, who had befriended Thomas during his work on mine safety. The ceremony lasted less than 15 minutes, and Catherine felt a strange disconnect between the simplicity of the event and the magnitude of what was happening, the formal beginning of a new life so different from anything she had imagined in her years behind convent walls. They left for Pennsylvania 3 days later, traveling by train through the mountains, watching the landscape change from the familiar peaks and valleys of North Carolina to the rolling hills and industrial towns of the northern states. Catherine pressed her face against the train window, feeling simultaneously liberated and unmoored, aware that with each mile she was moving further from everything she had known. Thomas sat beside her, holding her hand, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing stories about the places they passed, giving her space to process the enormity of the transition she was experiencing. Their new home in Pennsylvania was a small house in a company town called Riverside, located along the Allegheny River about 40 miles north of Pittsburgh. The town existed solely to serve the coal operations, with rows of identical wooden houses for workers, a company store that charged inflated prices, and a pervasive atmosphere of grim functionality. Thomas's position as chief safety engineer gave them slightly better accommodations than the average miner received, a house with 4 rooms instead of 2, and a small yard where Catherine could plant a garden come spring. But the town was harsh and unwelcoming, and Catherine quickly understood that their life here would be defined by hard work and modest circumstances rather than any romantic ideal of marital happiness. Catherine found work as a visiting nurse, traveling to miners' homes to care for the sick and injured. Her years of training with the Sisters of Mercy had given her skills that were in high demand in a place where medical care was scarce and often inadequate. The work was exhausting and often heartbreaking, bringing her face to face with the brutal realities of industrial poverty, families living in conditions that bred disease and despair, children dying from preventable illnesses because their parents could not afford proper treatment. But the work also gave Catherine a sense of purpose that helped ease the adjustment to her new life, a way to use her calling to service even outside the religious context where she had originally developed it. The first year of marriage was more difficult than either of them had anticipated. Thomas worked long hours at the mine, often leaving before dawn and returning after dark, exhausted by the constant battles with management over safety improvements they resisted as too costly. Catherine struggled with loneliness in a town where she knew no one and where the other miners' wives viewed her with suspicion, aware that she had been a nun and uncertain how to relate to someone with such an unusual history. The cramped house felt oppressive after the spacious stone corridors of the convent, and Catherine found herself missing the rhythms of communal prayer, the companionship of the other sisters, the sense of being part of something larger than herself. She wrote letters to Sister Helena and Sister Bernadette, trying to maintain some connection to the women who had been her family for 6 years. The letters were returned unopened, marked with a notation that the recipients were not permitted to receive correspondence from laywomen who had left religious life. Mother Superior Agatha had implemented the Church's policy of complete separation, ensuring that Catherine's existence would not disturb the spiritual focus of the remaining sisters. The returned letters hurt more than Catherine had expected, a tangible reminder that she had been erased from that chapter of her life as thoroughly as if she had died. By the spring of 1893, Catherine was pregnant. The news brought joy mixed with anxiety, as she worried about bringing a child into the harsh conditions of Riverside and struggled with morning sickness that made her nursing work more challenging. Thomas was delighted at the prospect of fatherhood, and his happiness helped Catherine reconnect with the feelings that had drawn them together in the first place. They began to build a life that felt more stable, making friends among the miners and their families, creating small rituals and traditions that gave their days structure and meaning. Catherine gave birth to a daughter in December of 1893, a difficult labor that lasted nearly 20 hours and was complicated by excessive bleeding that almost cost Catherine her life. Thomas named the baby Rose, after his mother who had died when he was young, and Catherine held her daughter with a fierce love that surprised her with its intensity. The baby was healthy and strong, with dark hair like her father and eyes that would eventually turn the same blue-gray as Catherine's. Caring for Rose gave Catherine a new focus, a way to channel the nurturing instincts that had drawn her to religious life in the first place. The years that followed brought both hardships and small joys. Thomas's work continued to be frustrating and often dangerous, as mine owners consistently prioritized profit over safety despite new regulations. Catherine balanced her nursing work with raising Rose, teaching her daughter to read and write, telling her stories about the mountains of North Carolina but never mentioning the 6 years spent in a convent or the vows she had taken and broken. Their second child, a son they named James, was born in 1895, and their family felt complete, a small unit bound by love and shared purpose in the midst of difficult circumstances. But the past never fully released its hold on Catherine. She still woke sometimes in the night, her heart racing, dreaming that she was back in the convent, that the bells were ringing for lauds, that Mother Superior Agatha was calling her to account for her sins. She attended Protestant services in Riverside because the Catholic Church there had been informed of her history and made clear she was not welcome to receive the sacraments. The Protestant hymns felt foreign to her, lacking the majesty and history of the Latin masses she had known, but she valued the community and the spiritual structure that church attendance provided. In 1900, Thomas was injured in a mine collapse that broke 3 ribs and punctured a lung. He survived but was left with chronic breathing problems that made it difficult to continue working underground. The family moved to Pittsburgh, where Thomas found work with a reform organization dedicated to improving mining's safety through legislation and public advocacy. The move to a larger city provided better opportunities for the children and allowed Catherine to expand her nursing practice, working in a settlement house that served immigrant families crowded into tenement buildings. The years in Pittsburgh brought a measure of peace and stability that had eluded them in Riverside. Catherine developed friendships with other women involved in social reform work, educated women who valued her skills and dedication without judging her complicated past. Rose and James attended good schools and grew into thoughtful young people who inherited their parents' commitment to justice and service. By 1910, as Catherine approached her 40s, she had built a life that felt meaningful and purposeful, even if it was nothing like what she had imagined as a young girl entering the convent. But Catherine never forgot her years as Sister Mary Catherine, never stopped thinking about the women she had left behind at the Sisters of Mercy Convent. She occasionally received news from Black Mountain through Dr. Warren, who wrote periodically to update her on developments in the town. She learned that Mother Superior Agatha had died in 1902, that Sister Helena had passed away in 1907, that the convent had taken in orphans from another mine disaster in 1908. Each piece of news struck her with a complex mix of emotions, grief for the losses, nostalgia for the life she had left, and a persistent question about whether she had made the right choice. In 1912, Catherine received a letter from Sister Bernadette, the first direct communication from anyone at the convent in 20 years. The young novice she had known was now Mother Superior of the Sisters of Mercy, having succeeded Mother Agatha's replacement after that woman's sudden death from a stroke. Sister Bernadette, now Mother Superior Bernadette, wrote to inform Catherine that the convent was updating its records and had discovered that Sister Mary Catherine's name had been completely removed from all documents, her years of service erased as if they had never occurred. This was apparently more thorough than was typical even for sisters who left religious life, and Mother Superior Bernadette wanted to know if Catherine wished to have her service acknowledged in some form, perhaps through a notation in the archives. The letter surprised Catherine, both in its arrival after so many years of silence and in the choice it presented. Mother Superior Bernadette made clear that any acknowledgement would be private, visible only to future historians who might examine the convent's records, and would in no way restore Catherine's standing with the Church or reconnect her to the religious community. But it would establish that she had existed, that Sister Mary Catherine had been real, that those 6 years of service and devotion had happened. The question was whether Catherine wanted that acknowledgement or preferred to let the erasure stand, to keep that chapter of her life separate from the person she had become. Catherine spent weeks considering her response. She thought about her children, who knew nothing of their mother's time in the convent, and wondered how they would feel to learn that history. She discussed it with Thomas, now in his 50s and still working despite his damaged lungs, still fighting for reforms that would make mining safer for the next generation of workers. He encouraged her to decide based on what felt right to her, not based on concerns about how others might react or what the Church might think. In the end, Catherine wrote back to Mother Superior Bernadette and declined the offer to be reinstated in the records. She explained that the erasure, painful as it had been, represented an important truth about the choice she had made. When she left the convent, she had made a decision to become someone new, to step fully into a secular life with all its challenges and possibilities. Preserving her name in the convent's archives would suggest that Sister Mary Catherine still existed in some form, that Catherine had never fully let go of that identity. But the truth was that Sister Mary Catherine had ceased to exist on September 15, 1892, and the woman who had emerged from that ending was someone different, someone forged by love and sacrifice and the daily work of building a life outside the walls of religious obligation. Catherine died in 1928, at the age of 60, from pneumonia that her damaged immune system could not fight. Thomas survived her by only 3 months, his lungs finally giving out after decades of breathing coal dust and fighting for reforms that came too slowly to save most of the men he had tried to protect. Their children, Rose and James, mourned their parents and honored their memory by continuing the work of social reform and service to the poor that had defined their family's life. No record of Sister Mary Catherine remains in any official church document or convent archive. The years she spent with the Sisters of Mercy in Black Mountain, North Carolina, were erased as completely as the Church knew how to erase things it wished to forget. The letters she exchanged with Thomas Brennan were burned by Mother Superior Agatha after Catherine's departure. The work she had done in the infirmary, the lives she had touched during those years of service, left no trace in any historical record, but in the memories of the miners' families in western Pennsylvania, in the settlement house records in Pittsburgh that documented her decades of nursing work, in the letters and journals kept by her children and grandchildren, Catherine's life was preserved. Not as Sister Mary Catherine, the nun who broke her vows, but as Catherine Brennan, wife, mother, nurse, and advocate for the poor and forgotten. She lived a life of service that honored the calling she had felt as a young girl, even if the form of that service looked nothing like what the Church had demanded of her. The story of Sister Mary Catherine and Thomas Brennan was one of thousands of similar stories, women who left religious life for love, for doubt, for the simple human need to choose their own path. Most of these women were erased from history, their names struck from records, their years of service forgotten or deliberately obscured. The Church's practice of complete separation ensured that their departures would not inspire others to question their vocations or challenge the demands of religious obedience. In erasing these women, the Church believed it was protecting the integrity of religious life and the sanctity of vows taken before God. But what was really erased was the complexity of human experience, the reality that faith and love are not always compatible, that devotion can take many forms, and that a life of service does not require the surrender of all personal desire. Catherine's story, and the stories of countless women like her, represent a hidden history of women who made impossible choices in a time when the options available to them were severely limited, who sacrificed one kind of holiness to pursue another kind of wholeness, and who were punished for that choice by being written out of the record entirely. The mountains of North Carolina still stand as they did in 1892, and the Sisters of Mercy Convent still operates, though much changed. From the stark stone building where Sister Mary Catherine spent 6 years of her young life. The mining towns of Pennsylvania have mostly disappeared, the coal seems exhausted, the companies that ran them dissolved or transformed. But the human stories, the moments of connection and choice and sacrifice that happened in these places, continue to echo across time, preserved not in official records but in the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of lives lived fully despite all the forces that tried to constrain them. Catherine Brennan lived for 36 years after leaving the convent, years filled with love and work and the satisfaction of a life lived according to her own conscience rather than someone else's rules. Whether those years justified the vows she broke, whether her happiness outweighed the sin of abandoning her commitment to God, these are questions that cannot be answered from any distance. What can be said is that she made a choice that required tremendous courage, that she built a life of meaning and service despite being erased from the only historical record that might have preserved her story, and that her erasure says more about the institutions that enforced it than about the worth of the woman herself. To uncover more stories that reveal the hidden secrets and forgotten mysteries of the past, leave a like if this deep investigation kept you hooked until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Did you know that 80% of people who watch aren't subscribed and end up missing incredible stories? It costs nothing. Oh, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share other dark tales that, in your opinion, deserve to be explored here on the channel. See you soon.